Sadie Callahan was 13 years old, and she had a habit nobody in Wexford County understood. She wasn't chasing attention. She wasn't looking for praise. She had a single, quiet purpose, and she carried it the way she carried everything else on her grandfather's farm, without a word of explanation to anyone. If stories of quiet determination and old wisdom rediscovered move you, subscribe and join us every day. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from every corner of this community. Wexford County sat in the rolling hill country of Kentucky, where the creeks ran low by August and the clay soil cracked into stubborn plates under a summer sun. Walter Callahan's farm had been in the family for 3 generations. A patchwork of pasture land, a weathered white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, and outbuildings that had settled into the earth like old men into their chairs. Walter was 68, broad-shouldered but slower than he used to be. His gray beard trimmed close, his straw hat permanently creased from decades of the same fold. He raised 11 brown and white goats, a Jersey cow named Clover, a small flock of Rhode Island red hens, and enough vegetables to keep the root cellar full through winter. His wife Eleanor had passed 3 years earlier, but her presence lingered in small ways. A beekeeping journal on the kitchen shelf, a photograph on the mantel, her handwriting still visible on faded recipe cards tucked into a drawer. Sadie had lived with her grandfather since she was 9. She was quiet, freckle-faced, her blonde hair kept in a single braid that swung when she worked. She wore the same faded plaid shirt most days, denim overalls patched at the knee, and rubber boots 2 sizes too big that had once belonged to someone else. She noticed things other people didn't. She noticed the way the well water had started running thin by June. She noticed how Walter's shoulders tightened every time he checked the rain gauge nailed to the porch post. And she noticed, tucked behind the old hay barn, half swallowed by blackberry brambles and rust, something almost everyone in Wexford County had forgotten existed: a cistern. It had been built by Walter's own grandfather back in the 1920s, an underground stone and mortar tank meant to catch and hold rainwater off the barn roof for exactly the kind of dry summer Wexford County was now living through. Somewhere along the way, nobody could say exactly when, it had been abandoned. The gutters that once fed it had rotted and fallen. The access hatch had rusted shut. Weeds had claimed the ground above it so thoroughly that most folks who drove past the Callahan place had no idea it was even there. Wexford County was in trouble that summer. The rains that usually came through in May and June had skipped the region almost entirely. By the second week of July, the county extension office had posted a drought advisory. Wells across the valley were dropping. The Hargrove place 2 farms over had already trucked in water for their cattle. Neighbors talked about it at the feed store, at church, at the gas station on Route 9. Always the same worried tone, always looking up at a sky that refused to deliver. Walter felt it most in his knees when he walked out to check the pond behind the pasture, watching the muddy ring around its edge grow wider every week. He didn't say much about it to Sadie. He didn't have to. She could see it in the way he stood at the kitchen window in the evenings, coffee going cold in his hand, staring out at land that had fed this family for 90 years. That was when Sadie started disappearing after her chores. She didn't tell Walter what she was doing. She didn't tell Dale Hargrove, the heavy-set neighbor who sometimes stopped by to trade tools, or his brother Roy, lean and quiet, who ran cattle on the ridge above the county road. She simply started walking out behind the hay barn every afternoon with a machete borrowed from the tool shed, a flashlight, and a 5-gallon bucket. And she didn't come back inside until the light was nearly gone. The first week was nothing but brambles. Sadie's arms came home scratched and stinging, her plaid shirt snagged in a dozen places. She worked the thorny blackberry canes back inch by inch, exposing first a corner of stone, then a full section of wall. Then finally, the rusted iron hatch set flush into the ground. It took her 3 more days just to break the hatch free, prying at the hinges with a crowbar until her palms blistered. "What in the world are you doing back there?" Dale Hargrove asked one afternoon, leaning over the fence line with his ball cap pushed back. "Just cleaning something up," Sadie said, and kept walking. Dale laughed and shook his head, telling Roy later that evening that the Callahan girl was out there digging around in a hole nobody had touched since before he was born. "Waste of a good summer," he said. "That old tank's been dry as a bone for 40 years. Probably cracked clean through by now." Word got around, the way it does in a small county. By the second week, a few of the men from church had taken to ribbing Walter about it at the feed store. "Heard your granddaughter's excavating back there," one of them said, grinning. "She find any buried treasure yet?" Walter just smiled thinly and said Sadie had her own way of doing things. He didn't fully understand it either, but he'd learned not to get in her way. Inside, though, Walter worried. He worried about snakes in that overgrown corner. He worried about the girl overworking herself in the heat. And more than once, watching her trudge back to the house each evening covered in dirt. He wondered if this was simply a 13-year-old's way of grieving, of doing something, anything, with her hands while the drought squeezed the whole county tight. Once the hatch was clear, Sadie climbed down with a flashlight for the first time. The tank was larger than she expected, nearly 12 feet across and 8 feet deep, its stone walls slick with old mineral streaks. There was less than a foot of stagnant foul water pooled at the bottom, and a thick layer of silt and leaf debris that had built up over decades. But the walls, when she ran her hand along them, felt solid. No cracks she could find, no collapse, just neglect. She found Eleanor's journal that same week, tucked in a box in the hall closet while searching for an old gutter diagram Walter mentioned might exist somewhere in the house. It wasn't the beekeeping journal everyone knew about. This was older, a farm ledger from the early years of Eleanor and Walter's marriage, filled with notes on rainfall, garden yields, and household repairs. On a page dated August 1962, in Eleanor's careful handwriting, Sadie found a single line. "Told W the cistern could carry us through a dry year if we ever needed it. He says the well's enough. I hope he's right." Sadie read that line 3 times. Then she went back out to the cistern with a new kind of purpose. She started hauling out the silt bucket by bucket, 20, 30, 40 trips a day, dumping the muck into the garden beds where it would do some good instead of going to waste. She scrubbed the stone walls with a stiff brush and diluted vinegar, the way she'd read old homesteading accounts describe. She replaced the rotted section of gutter above the barn roof herself, salvaging aluminum downspout pipe from a stack of scrap metal Walter had been meaning to haul to the recycling center, cutting it to length with a hacksaw and fitting it by trial and error until water ran the direction she wanted instead of sideways off the roof edge. Her first attempt at the gutter joint failed completely. The first real rain, just a quick afternoon shower, barely a quarter inch, sent water spraying sideways out of a gap she'd misjudged. And she stood there soaked, staring at 3 days of work draining uselessly into the weeds. She didn't cry. She just measured the gap again, found a wider strip of flashing in the scrap pile, and refit the seam the next morning before school. It held. By the start of August, the cistern was clean, the gutter system was functional, and the access hatch had been rehung on new hinges Sadie had asked Dale Pruitt, a farmer down the road, to weld for her in exchange for a dozen eggs a week. She'd told him only that she needed a hinge fixed. She hadn't told him why. Then came the storm. It rolled in from the southwest on the second Saturday of August, The kind of storm the whole county had been praying for and had almost stopped believing would ever come. 2.5 inches fell in 6 hours. The dry creek beds ran again for the first time in weeks. And on the Callahan farm, water sheeted off the barn roof, down the rebuilt gutter, through the downspout, and into the cistern below, filling it nearly 4 feet deep by morning. Walter didn't know any of this had happened until Sadie let him out back the next day and pulled open the hatch to show him. He stood at the edge, looking down at 4 feet of clear, cold water where there had been nothing but rubble and shame for 40 years. And he didn't say anything for a long moment. "How long you been working on this?" he finally asked. "Since the drought started," Sadie said. "I found Grandma's notebook. She always said this could carry us through." Word spread fast after that. The Hargrove place was still trucking in water for their herd. Half the county was on restricted well use. But the Callahan farm had 4 feet of stored rainwater and a working gutter system feeding it every time a cloud opened up. Dale Hargrove drove over himself to see it, standing at the hatch with his cap in his hands, shaking his head slowly. "I told Roy you were wasting your summer back there," he admitted to Sadie. "I was wrong. Dead wrong." By the end of August, 3 other families in Wexford County had old, forgotten cisterns of their own. Most farms built before 1950 had one somewhere. And Sadie found herself walking neighbors through the same process. Clear the brush, check the walls, rebuild the gutter, let the rain do the rest. She didn't charge for the help. She just wanted people to stop wasting what their grandparents had already built for them. That evening, sitting on the porch with a glass of sweet tea, Walter finally said what had been sitting in his chest since the day he'd looked down into that cistern. Wendell Berry once wrote that the soil is the great connector of lives, the source and destination of all. Walter said, turning his hat slowly in his hands. "I think about that watching you work, Sadie. Your grandmother believed the answers were already here, buried under what we'd forgotten to look after. She was right. The real harvest wasn't the water. It was remembering what was already ours." Sadie didn't say much back. She just looked out at the barn and the hatch and the gutter line catching the last gold light of evening, and felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the drought at all. What farming lesson has stayed with you the longest? Something old that turned out to matter more than anyone expected? Tell us in the comments below. And if you'd like to go deeper into stories like this one, we've got an ebook waiting for you in the description below, filled with the kind of quiet, practical wisdom that built farms like Walter's in the first place. Subscribe and join our community, because every day we're bringing you another story from the forgotten corners of rural America. We'll see you tomorrow with another story worth remembering.